I'm Michael Hainsworth. The age of Trump has changed the way we need to invest. War, tariffs, and inflationary fears have all changed the dynamic for ETF investing. As Peter Tomiuk tells me, set it and forget it no longer exists, if it ever did. So set it and forget it investing is dead.
I'm not sure if set it and forget it ever existed completely, but I'm wondering if this conversation is becoming much more important today due to the political climate we're in, combined with social media reminding us of it 24/7. And truthfully, I liken investing to buying a house. And if you intend to live in it for the next 30 years, you need to continuously assess the state of your house, everything around it. It could be the small day-to-day stuff like mowing the lawn in the summer, shoveling the driveway in the winter, but it could also be massive things, right? Like replacing your roof or renovating your living room. My point is, there's a lot of work under the hood that needs to be done continuously. And that's why I think it makes a very strong case that set it and forget it is probably not the way to go.
On this episode of On the Money, Peter Tomiuk helps us move past the old active versus passive debate and into a more useful conversation, investing on the ETF spectrum. We'll look at why just buy the S&P 500 may be an oversimplification, why rules-based strategies can be useful but rigid, and why active management may matter more when markets stop following the old playbook. But first, when we last talked about gold's mystique that few assets could match, we talked about how it's not the only safe haven in town. But the real issue is what role the gold should play when inflation bites, real yields move, and geopolitics rattle confidence. Because gold is not a perfect hedge. It doesn't produce cash flow, it doesn't compound like equities, and it doesn't always rise when markets fall. So treat it less like a bunker and more like insurance. That means keeping the position measured. Now, I don't know your particular personal financial situation, but for many investors, 3 to 7% of a total invested portfolio, that's pretty common. But do you buy the metal or an investment tied to it? Physical bullion offers direct exposure. Gold miners add operating leverage, but also equity market risk. Royalty and streaming companies can provide exposure with a different risk profile again. Now compare that with other defenses. Short-duration bonds can help when growth slows. Infrastructure can provide contracted cash flow. Defense dividend stocks like pipelines, utilities, they may offer you income while you ride out these unprecedented times. I sure could go for some precedented times right now. Peter, ETFs began as a simple way to replicate an indice, but things have changed so dramatically over the last 35 years.
No kidding, Michael. ETFs started here actually in Canada in 1990, and in the beginning, they were really meant to be an efficient way to get exposure to major indexes in a very low-cost way. And unlike mutual funds, they're listed on an exchange, right? Now, many of those original indexes that ETFs were attempting to replicate were market cap weighted indexes like the S&P, the NASDAQ, and the TSX, and so on, right? And let's face it, if the industry just remained like that, we probably have about 20 tickers listed globally, and that's about it. And the truth is, we have over 14,000 ETFs listed globally now, nearly 2,000 of those listed on Canadian exchanges. Now, the question is, how did that happen, right? First began an evolution on the indexes that ETFs were replicating. So instead of just replicating market cap weighted indexes like the S&P, ETFs started replicating new and different indexes. And the truth is now there are millions of indexes that exist globally. So there's no shortage of what ETFs can replicate. And in my opinion, Michael, the big turning point was when someone said, hey, why do ETFs even need to replicate an index at all? And that opened the door and perhaps even Pandora's box to ETFs that are now fully active with a full discretionary portfolio manager calling the shots.
So when you open that Pandora's box, a few things happen, I can imagine. It changes, first of all, that whole debate of active versus passive investing.
Well, it certainly does, right? Broadly speaking, the industry defines a passive ETF as a vehicle that passively replicates a published index, and an active ETF is one that doesn't. So it sounds simple, right? But not really. As indexes have evolved, they become much more active in nature. So for example, An equal weight index might have to rebalance their holdings periodically to ensure that their holdings are equally weighted. So it's not too active, but there's some movement. But what if you have a rules-based index that is meant to identify something like Canadian value companies through a variety of screens and filters? Well, look, there's some stock picking going on, but even if an ETF is still passively replicating those indexes, the indexes are actively making moves. Now, on the flip side, you have many active ETFs that aren't active at all. And I'll give you an example, HISA ETFs. Now, these are high interest savings account ETFs, commonly known as cash ETFs, and they really got popular in 2022 when, Michael, we were finally able to get some decent return on our cash. Now, what these ETFs do is that they simply take your proceeds, they invest them into high interest savings accounts, primarily with major banks, and then interest is accrued and then paid back to the unit holder on a monthly basis. My point is, it doesn't replicate an index, but does that sound active to you? So where I'm getting at, pragmatically speaking, ETFs defined as passive can be more active than ETFs defined as active and vice versa. And I believe that traditional industry labels don't necessarily tell the whole story anymore.
Every ETF style seems to be trying to address the shortcomings of another ETF style.
Absolutely. Now, I'm a firm believer in that. And let's be honest, when the first ETFs were created, they were addressing some issues in the investment landscape at the time. It was very hard to get low-cost exposure to broad indexes and to be able to trade them intraday. And also actively managed mutual funds back then, they were very expensive, right? And many of them were very black box in nature. So you could only get in and out at the end of the day. And these first ETFs were solving many shortcomings in the active investment landscape at the time.
Let's look at some examples here. You talk about market cap weighted strategies as an example, equal weight strategy, smart beta. What are each of these major types of strategies trying to address in another?
Look, they're trying to address the shortcomings of market cap weighted ETFs. I'll give you an example. If you take a look at market cap weighted ETFs, they're going to weight their companies based on size. So I think, Michael, there was a lot of people that said, hey, I love this ETF wrapper. I don't necessarily like the investment methodology within it, because why should a company just be a larger weighting of a portfolio just because of its size? So when you think about it, equal weight actually solves for that, right? Instead of weighting it by size, they say, hey, we're going to weight them equally. Here's the issue, though, Michael. It solves the market cap weighted problem, but is equal weight the way to go? Like, why should you weight them equally? Shouldn't fundamentals mean something, right? And that's where full discretionary active comes in. If you are not limited to predefined rules, then you have the ability to do the analysis on these companies and then weight them according to fundamentals, weight them based on growth prospects going forward, and so on.
Okay, so if we need to look at exchange traded funds on a spectrum, where do market cap weighted ETFs, rules-based ETFs, and discretionary active sit?
Well, I love that question, Michael, because what you're doing here is that you're changing the traditional active versus passive debate, which I find, again, is a little bit too simplistic today. The spectrum that you're asking about, I feel that market cap weighted ETFs can be on the far left-hand goalpost, right? And then you have full discretionary active ETFs on the right-hand goalpost. And you can see that they're polar opposites, right? One of them has very, very little active management within, and the other one has full discretionary active management. And then you have the large rules-based strategies in between, right? In between those two concepts. And those could be quasi-active or quasi-passive. I'll give you an example. You mentioned equal weight strategies. Well, equal weight strategies, there's not too much movement in them. So I would say that they're not necessarily as far left as market cap weighted indexes, but it's close. But if you have smart beta strategies that are, quantitatively looking for stocks that fit a certain style or a certain factor that are rebalanced periodically, well, then it gets much more closer to the right-hand side. Not quite full discretionary active, but getting closer.
So far, Peter has reframed the ETF conversation. Every ETF style is trying to solve the shortcomings of another. Market cap weighted ETFs solve for cost and access. Rules-based ETFs solve for discipline and transparency, and active ETFs try to solve for rigidity and a lack of adaptability. But now I want to poke the bear, and I want to point out that active managers are not always picking winners. I want to address, Peter, this issue that comes up immediately. Investors read that many active managers fail to outperform the S&P 500 over long periods of time. Why should they consider active ETFs at all then?
Well, Michael, I have to admit, I do get a little riled up every time I read an article or some statement. I find it tends to oversimplify the issue. Oftentimes that statement is incomplete. And I also don't like the fact that it insinuates that an S&P 500 ETF is probably the only equity investment an investor should consider in their portfolios.
That's a huge point, isn't it? We're looking at the benchmark as the benchmark when it shouldn't necessarily be.
I agree with you, right? And let's break down why. What are the underlying mandates being analyzed? Many actively managed ETFs have different objectives, right? They could be growth oriented, they could be value, they could be meant to provide defensive exposure, others might be more income oriented. And the reasons why those mandates are created is to address client needs. And we know that client needs can be complex, right? I'll give you a couple examples. Like, what if an investor has income needs in retirement and downside risk mitigation is also primary importance? What's the S&P 500 going to do for you there, right? So, what if it's a younger investor that will need to make a down payment on a home in the next 12 months? There's nothing in the S&P 500 that places a conscious focus on that stuff. It's like, at the end of the day, Michael, it's an index that is designed to measure the performance of large U.S. companies and serve as a representative proxy for the U.S. large cap equity market. That's it.
And is it really doing that? Because when you look at a market cap weighted ETF, it's backward looking. Investors are missing something important about how these funds are built.
Market cap weighted indexes, they're going to weight all holdings in proportion to their size. It means that large companies will have more influence on the return of the index versus smaller companies. But as you said, it also means that if you have companies that are going up faster than other companies in the index, over time, they will become larger and larger weightings. This means that your holdings become a larger weight in the index after it has already grown. And I think ideally, you want to have a large allocation to that company before it's grown. And that's a potential massive value add that full discretionary active ETFs can provide versus cap weighted ETFs. I think it's worth paying a fee for managers to find the next NVIDIA, to find the next Apple, to find the next Microsoft before becoming the companies you see today. And now, Michael, not all actively managed ETFs are tasked with doing that, but there are certainly active growth ETFs out there meant to track those down. And, just to kind of put a bow on it, a market cap weighted strategy will never give you the exposure to the next big thing. However, it will give you a lot of exposure to the company once it already has become the big thing. And there can be positives to that, but there can also be risks as well.
I think it's super important that we hammer home this key point, which is that success should be measured against an individual investor's objective, not against a benchmark.
I couldn't agree with you more, Michael. The S&P 500 is such a famous index, right? That we've just gotten very used to benchmarking ourselves to it, regardless of what we're investing, regardless of what our objective is. I'll give you an example. If you're an individual investor, right, and your main priority is downside protection and income generation, you shouldn't be comparing yourself to the S&P 500. You can underperform the S&P 500 and still be hitting your objectives exactly the way you want and you should be.
Because sectors don't move in tandem and market cap weighted strategies don't really actively assess whether sector weights are appropriate for the current environment, how should an investor think about portfolio construction inside a market weighted ETF?
I've had many industry professionals tell me, Michael, that choosing the stocks is the science, but allocating to them is the art, right? So when you have full discretionary active management, once you actually decide upon what companies you want to own, then there's rigorous analysis on how you should allocate them. Then there's a whole other part. How does every company and every sector move with each other, right? They're all correlated in a very different way, right? That's something that discretionary portfolio managers are going to spend a tremendous amount of time analyzing, where a lot of market cap weighted and rules based strategies have a much more mechanical or even a set it and forget it approach to it.
Peter makes the case that the S&P 500 is a powerful tool, but not a complete financial plan. It gives us efficient liquidity, low-cost exposure to large U.S. companies, but can also be concentrated, growth-heavy, backward-looking, and poorly matched to investors who need income, downside protection, liquidity, or a different risk profile. So I want to move into the middle of the ETF spectrum, the rules-based strategies. They offer discipline, transparency, and consistency. Let's talk about the fact that rules-based strategies have a playbook. Active managers can adapt. Where do rules-based strategies work well?
This is a very, very large space, and they can be referred to as quant ETFs and smart beta ETFs and factor-based ETFs. And in my opinion, these type of ETFs try to be the middle ground that solve for issues in both market cap weighted ETFs and full discretionary active ETFs. The strength of these ETFs revolve around the fact that they tend to have very rigid methodologies. They're emotionless in their execution. They provide a level of active management, but they're not full discretionary either, right? It's completely based on their predefined rules. In a nutshell, they offer a form of active management at a lower cost than full discretionary active ETFs, but usually tend to offer the simplicity and transparency of market cap weighted ETFs. In my opinion, they do accomplish that goal, but also because of their discipline, I've found that they make for great building blocks in portfolios.
But the thing is that rules-based strategies can run into trouble. Where should we be concerned?
The rules for rules-based ETFs are oftentimes determined by using historical data. This makes sense because if you're going to prescribe rules that are meant to provide a value add, you have to check to see if it works, right? That's why I often make a joke. Find me a rules-based ETF with a fourth quartile back-tested track record. You just can't find it. The problem is that you get vastly changing markets, and these mandates may not be well positioned in that new environment, and they don't have the flexibility to adjust accordingly. There's also other things too, Michael. I mean, choosing stocks requires a ton of analysis. Rules-based strategies tend to limit choosing companies to quantitative screens, which which companies have the best ratios that fit a certain style. This analysis is very good, but it doesn't tell us the full story. What about qualitative considerations like the strength in management, the strength in the products and the services that these companies are providing, right? So that qualitative analysis helps give an idea of how companies are going to perform going forward. And many quantitative screens indicate how companies have already done. And the last thing I'll mention on that as well, Michael, is that portfolio construction tends to be basic. Again, choosing the stocks is a science, allocating is the art, right? So a lot of these rules-based strategies tend to have very rigid rules on how they choose their stocks. And that art requires a strategy that's a little bit more than just simply being mechanical.
Yeah, whenever I talk to a quant, I'll ask them things like, and what do you think of the CEO? They don't care about the CEO. And that absolutely blows my mind that you would be making investment decisions without thinking about the humans behind that organization and the direction that they would be taking that company in the future. My favorite example was Research in Motion. Jim Balsley, Mike Lazaridis were like, the iPhone's a toy. We'll never have a color screen. We'll never have an iPad. I'm like, these guys are out of touch. But the quants would have told you that things were looking just fine. Thank you very much. And I think it brings to the front the issue that markets evolve faster than rules.
Oh, I agree with that. And maybe even more so today, right? I mean, it could be due to 24/7 social media. It could be the rapid change in technological advancements that we've had over the last decade. It might even be partially due to Donald Trump, Michael. Who knows? I suspect it's a little bit all of the above, right? As the world changes, rules-based strategies will be married to its predefined rules in past markets. And look, that could be good from an emotionless discipline standpoint, but it can also be a shortcoming if we enter a completely different environment. And Michael, we see that more often than people think. I think a major example has been the last 4 years, right? We've had a lot of inflation. We haven't seen this kind of inflation since the late 1970s, the early 1980s. How many rules-based strategies do you think were launched in the last 10 years that had predefined rules from that era? So rules-based strategies can't evolve, but markets are continuously evolving all the time.
As an active guy yourself, give me some examples of where you zigged where others had zagged, and then that helped save the day.
At the end of the day, Michael, all the shortcomings that we've just discussed, right, can be addressed by full discretionary active management. Like, for example, when selecting stocks, portfolio managers can incorporate screens like rules-based ETFs do. I know that, the portfolio managers that I deal with on a regular basis, that's usually the first thing that they do to actually find those initial stocks that they want to analyze. But then they'll take it one step further and they'll research a company in depth. They'll speak to the CEOs. They'll analyze the product. They'll do the qualitative stuff, right? And then when deciding on the stocks in a portfolio, the PM is going to spend time and resources on constructing that portfolio that makes sense. They're going to analyze how companies and sectors are correlated to each other. And that should help both harness returns and reduce risks through well thought out diversification. And they also have the ability to trim and add exposures. They have the ability to analyze the macroeconomic environment and then decide if they need to adapt. They have that flexibility. And all of this, in my opinion, is extremely necessary to ensure your ETFs have all the necessary tools to adapt and thrive in different market conditions from both a risk and a reward standpoint.
So set it and forget it investing is dead.
I'm not sure if set it and forget it ever existed completely, but I'm wondering if this conversation is becoming much more important today due to the political climate we're in, combined with social media reminding us of it 24/7. And truthfully, I liken investing to buying a house, right? Buying a new house. When you buy that new house, hopefully when you grab the keys, it looks beautiful. But if you intend to live in it for the next 30 years, you need to continuously assess the state of your house, everything around it. It could be the small day-to-day stuff like mowing the lawn in the summer, shoveling the driveway in the winter, but it could also be massive things, right? Like replacing your roof or renovating your living room. My point is you are probably going to have your investment portfolio for the rest of your life. So even though that portfolio is going to stay with you, there's a lot of work under the hood that needs to be done continuously. And that's why I think it makes a very strong case that set it and forget it is probably not the way to go.
All right. So before I wrap up this conversation so I can cut my lawn, how should advisors explain the ETF spectrum to clients who still think the world is simply a case of active versus passive?
At the end of the day, ETFs are wrappers and they fit along a spectrum. And that spectrum is based on how active the underlying investment strategy is. And every ETF on every part of that spectrum is going to have benefits and shortcomings. Weigh them out. A low-cost ETF might seem great, but hey, be careful. And Michael, at the end of the day, your investment portfolio will be with you for the rest of your life. Don't take shortcuts. Know what ETFs you own to the best of your ability.
Peter, great speaking with you as always. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michael.
ETFs have come a long way from their original role as a low-cost index tracker. As Peter explains, the real question is not whether an ETF is active or passive. The real question is what strategy is under the wrapper. Market cap weighted ETFs, rules-based ETFs, active ETFs, they all have a role. They all have some limitations. Some are cheap and efficient, but rigid. Some are transparent and disciplined, but built on historical rules. Some are more expensive, but give managers the ability to analyze, adapt, and respond. If you understand the ETF spectrum, you're on the money. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thanks for joining us. Please like and subscribe to ensure the algorithm puts the important conversations like this in front of people that you care most about.